Good afternoon and welcome to Town Meeting Television's continuing coverage of Town Meeting 21. I'm so glad to be here today with Jack Hanson. He is a city councilor representing the East District, that's wards 1 and 8. Jack, thanks so much for joining us to talk about the charter change to implement ranked choice voting for city council seats. We're so glad you could join us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on the program.
So just high level, how many ballot questions will Burlington voters be voting on today? On March 2nd.
Sure, yeah. So there's going to be 4 charter change proposals, and I can explain what a charter change is a bit later, but there's 4 charter change proposals. There's 2 ballot advisory questions where the voters can advise the city council and mayor what to do on an issue. And then there's the school budget, the Burlington School District coming to the voters to ask for a budget increase for the Burlington School District.
And unlike our neighboring communities that often vote on the municipal budgets, Burlington voters don't vote directly on the municipal budget, do they?
Correct, yeah. The mayor's administration brings their draft budget to the council in June, and then the council is able to amend and adopt the city's annual budget.
All right. Well, thank you for taking the time to work on this issue and talk with us today about ranked choice voting. Why don't we open your presentation and get an overview of what this particular ballot question is about, this charter change?
Great. So can you all see this presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I took some materials from Fair Vote, which is a nonpartisan organization that works on these issues. And so I just wanted to give them some credit because some of these slides are their materials. And that's their website if you want to look into that organization. So yeah, I can talk a little bit about the current electoral system that we have in Burlington, and most places in the US have this winner take all system or some people call it first past the post system, but the candidate with the most votes, you choose one candidate and the candidate that gets the most votes typically wins the election, even if they don't cross a 50% threshold. So here's an example of you have many candidates. And so in a situation when you have many candidates, this means that a candidate can win with a relatively small percentage of the vote. So we'll give some examples of this, and we'll talk about some of the issues with the current voting system and kind of why I brought forward ranked choice voting to the city council. So limited voter choice, this ties in with sort of the vote splitting and strategic voting, but the current system, it discourages candidates from joining who feel that they don't have a good shot or they're not well known. And therefore it limits the choices that voters have. It also forces voters to be strategic in their voting and think about the practicality of their vote versus voting for their favorite candidate. So when there's multiple candidates in the race, there's this calculation of, oh, well, I might like candidate A, but they don't really have a shot. So let me just choose my preference between candidate B and C. That's often what we see in these races. And then, as I alluded to before, non-majority winners. You could have a candidate winning with 30% of the vote just because there were so many options on the ballot. So even if that candidate is really disliked by 70% of the voters, they could still come away with it in a scenario with many candidates. So here's an example from a presidential election from 1992, where you had Bill Clinton was elected with 43% of the vote. So part of the problem with our system is we don't really know people's true preferences. For example, if more people thought that Ross Perot actually had a shot at winning, would they have perhaps voted for him? Or if they knew with 100% certainty that he wasn't going to win, and it was just between Clinton and Bush, who would have taken that 18.9% of the vote that went to Ross Perot if they were just making a binary choice. We really don't know. With instant runoff voting, though, people get to put that second preference and their vote does get to be redistributed. And so you're able to get a fuller picture of what people actually want. The election of 2000 is very infamous for many reasons. One of the reasons that it's infamous is in Florida, where Florida ultimately, in many ways, decided the election because it was such a narrow margin and it is a high number of electoral votes. And in Florida, the margin of victory was very tiny. And Ralph Nader, who was the Green Party candidate, received many more votes than the margin. And the common knowledge or common assumption is that those Nader voters, just given their politics and given Nader's platform, would have probably preferred Gore over Bush, but Bush won Florida very narrowly. And so many people come away from that and, blame Nader for being the spoiler or blame those voters for basically swinging the election by voting for a candidate who didn't have a chance. And I think a lot of people come away from that and they say, oh, well, clearly Nader just shouldn't have run, and clearly these people just shouldn't have voted their conscience. They should have voted strategically and all that. But there's another way to look at this, which is we don't have to have a system that discourages other candidates and other viewpoints. We can have a system where people are allowed to vote their first preference and still not have their vote thrown away. So in this case, those votes would have been transferred from those Nader voters to their preferred candidate.
And that's because second choice counts. Your second
Exactly.
choice if Nader was eliminated as an option.
Exactly, because Nader would have been eliminated, and anyone who put Nader as their first choice, their votes would move to their second choice option. And we'd get a much clearer picture of who the actual preferred candidate was between Bush and Gore in Florida. Now, the presidential electoral system is flawed in ways well beyond what we're talking about here with the Electoral College. You can see that Gore actually still, got more votes overall, even with Nader's presence in the race, but that's not how we do presidential elections. So that's even more deeply flawed with the Electoral College system on another level. So there's many pieces of election reform that I think are really critical, and this is really just one of them. So ranked choice voting, we started to get into a little bit of how it works, but here's sort of a sample ballot. Say there's 3 candidates, and this voter put Brown as their number 1 choice and Castro as their number 2 choice and Adams as their number 3 choice. Just to be clear though, and this has come up before, you don't have to rank all the candidates. Say you really love Brown and you don't have any preference between Adams and Castro. You don't like either of them equally. You could leave the ballot blank beyond that. You could just put Brown as your number 1 and nothing. Or say, there's 5 candidates and there's one or 2 of them that you really don't like. You don't have to rank those 2 at all. So your vote would never end up getting transferred to those 2. So it doesn't require you to rank, but it gives you that opportunity to rank and express your preference beyond just a single preference. So here's an example of how an election could work under ranked choice voting. This is round 1. So we're looking at everyone's number 1 preference. And the furthest, and on the left bar, you can see the percent of the vote that each candidate got. So this bar that's in the darker orange, this is the candidate that got the most first preference votes. And you can see they got slightly over 40% of the vote. In Burlington, in the way we do elections now, and in most places, that candidate would immediately win. But under ranked choice voting, you now eliminate this bottom candidate that's highlighted in white. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse or not, but this candidate got the least amount of first round votes, that candidate's now eliminated. Clearly, that candidate is not the favorite of the voters. So they're eliminated. Anyone who chose that candidate as their first choice, their vote is now distributed to their second choice. So you can see some of those voters preferred the candidate on the left. Some of those voters preferred the candidate in the middle. So you kind of see that represented by these the boost that these two candidates have now gotten in this second round. So you'll see the candidate that was doing well in the first round is now doing even better and is really close to achieving that 50% majority. And really the 50% majority is what ranked choice voting is all about, is a candidate needs to have a majority of people that vote for them in order to be elected. And so this,
sorry,
go
not
ahead.
you, but currently 40% is required, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, in Burlington, and I'll get into that in future slides, but some systems do have a threshold that you have to hit, but they don't necessarily allow you to rank. What they do is, if no one hits that threshold, there's a separate runoff election that's held. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. But in this case, you don't need to hold that separate runoff. You can instantly transfer the votes, and that's why this system has also been called instant runoff voting, because there's that instant runoff that takes place. So when we talk about rounds, this is happening on the same night. You know, you're tabulating the votes immediately after. There's no lag time on this.
And are you then proposing that in Burlington, that 50% becomes the threshold for city council races?
Correct. So under this proposed system, 50% would be the threshold for victory. And so here's an example of this candidate after that redistribution. They're really close to 50%, but they've not crossed it yet. So we now need to go to the next round of voting. And so at this point, we eliminate the candidate with the least votes again. And now we're left with just these two remaining candidates. And when those votes get distributed, you see that this one candidate has now crossed that 50% threshold and has won the election. So that's an example of just the system playing out. And we did, you can see it on my social media page for my city council page. We did an example of this with music, where we had a local singer-songwriter that created a list of songs that she would be willing to perform. And then we had people join live, and we had people do ranked choice voting on what song they wanted to hear. And then we walked through the rounds, and it actually did take 3 or 4 rounds to come away with the song. But ultimately we did have a song, you know, that ended up winning after a few rounds. And she then performed that song live for everyone. So if people want to see a real example of the system being used and sort of the round by round, feel free to watch that video. It was a lot of fun. So I wanted to talk about some of the benefits of ranked choice voting. So more choices, it really allows you, it allows for more diversity, not only in terms of who you can vote for, but also who can run for office. It allows people to run for office without fear of playing the spoiler role. We actually had a city council election in Burlington was it last year or 2 years ago? Within the last 2 years, we had an election. If it was 2 years ago in the New North End, there was a 3-way race, and it was between a Democrat, an independent who had progressive support, and a Republican. But as the race went on, the Republican and Republican voters, feared that their presence in the race would essentially result in the independent with progressive support getting elected, because they would split the votes. Kind of more moderate and Republican votes would be split between the Democrat and the Republican. And so the Republican dropped out of the race, essentially giving voters less options and less choices and ways to express themselves on the ballot and show their preference. So that, I think, was a clear example of the problem with the current system. Is it forces people to drop out of races or just not even to enter a race. because they don't want to be that spoiler candidate, and they don't want to help their least favorite candidate get elected. And this system has been shown with ranked choice voting to lead to an increase of candidates, particularly among women and people of color running for office, and the success of women and people of color running for office is shown to improve under ranked choice voting. It does affect as well the dynamic of the race, and you see this bullet point of civil campaigns, because you have to think about the fact that if you're a candidate and you're out there just attacking and berating another candidate, well, people who like that candidate are probably not going to rank you second if you hate their candidate. And so there's a disincentive for you to be out there just trashing on other candidates, because you actually now do care what other voters think. You don't just care about your own supporters. You actually want supporters of other candidates to somewhat support you as well, because you want to get their second or third or fourth choice vote. And so it not only does it discourage negative campaigning, it also really encourages candidates to reach out to everyone in every community and every constituency and try to gain some support and try to listen to those communities and appeal to them. So there's a lot of benefits from that perspective. And then majority winners, we talked about that, but it requires that you actually have a majority of voters that support you in order to win. Yeah, here's just another example, a case study from the Santa Fe mayoral election in 2018. So these are the different candidates represented in different colors. None of them got 50% in the first round. The candidate with the least is redistributed. And it was kind of a mixture of where those votes went, where those second preferences were, another redistribution, and the final redistribution. So oftentimes, it's the candidate that was ahead in the first round will ultimately end up winning, but not always. And even when they do, there's a benefit to actually knowing that, rather than having someone win with 40% and wondering if people actually support them. So this is a map of where it's used. It's really expanded a lot in recent years. A lot more states have used it in presidential primaries. New York City uses it for primary elections now. Maine uses it. Maine and most recently Alaska adopted it for statewide elections. Maine's already been using it for statewide and presidential elections. And then there's examples throughout the country, and you can see the color coding at the bottom of the different types of uses. It's also been used internationally for over 100 years, and these are some of the countries that use it. So I want to just give a recent example that's really interesting. So the US Senate race in Georgia, we now know the outcome of that was the two Democrats, Ossoff and Warnock, were elected, and it flipped control of the US Senate. That would not have happened if they used the system that we use in Burlington, because David Perdue would have won under the way that Burlington votes. The way that Georgia votes is if no candidate reaches 50%, there's a separate runoff election between the top two candidates. And I believe that that's an improvement over how we do it in Burlington, to have that separate runoff. And some folks would argue for that over even ranked choice voting. I think with ranked choice voting, you get similar benefits to the runoff, but it doesn't lead to, in many cases, when you have that separate runoff, there's lower turnout. And so you get a less fuller picture of where people are at. That's not always true, but that's typically the case, that the separate runoff will have lower voter turnout. So that's kind of one of the biggest downsides compared to ranked choice voting. The other is just the cost of holding a separate special election is relatively significant, especially at the local level for a small town to take on that extra cost. But so anyway, so the Georgia system, I think, is incorporates some of the benefits of ranked choice voting, where you don't just give it to the first round winner. You actually someone has to actually get 50%, and that might require a runoff. And ultimately that changed the outcome of this race, where Purdue would have won under Burlington's system, for example, but Ossoff ended up winning the runoff. And
Because
that,
of
and what's that,
40%,
Lauren?
because of Burlington's 40% threshold.
Right. In Burlington, there is potentially a runoff if no one hits 40%, which is good, because in some electoral systems, there's no runoff threshold. And like I said, someone could win with 20% of the vote if there's 12 candidates. Burlington, we do have this threshold where if no one gets 40%, the top two go to a runoff, and we have had that happen. But in Georgia, it's 50%, and in some places it's 50%, and under RCV, it's a 50% threshold. And the consequences, I think this is the perfect example of your voting system, are enormous. In this case, control of the US Senate was shifted because of the voting system that Georgia uses. And most states don't use this voting system that Georgia uses. So I think it's a very interesting example. This is the Burlington mayoral election in 2018. So you see that Moreau Weinberger didn't quite hit that 50% threshold. Similarly, in the last case, Purdue was very close but didn't quite hit. Now, it was different because the margin between the next candidate was much greater. But this upcoming mayoral election and other examples, we don't know what the margin is going to be. We could see a situation this year where a candidate has 43%, another one has 41%. And do we really know who's preferred between the 43 and the 41? No, you can't know that unless you have that runoff. Go ahead, Lauren.
I just want to remind our viewers, we have about 7 or 8 minutes left, but that this proposal, this charter change for ranked choice voting would be for city council elections only.
Yeah,
right. And
correct. So let me shift into that. And I didn't think I was going to use up the whole time, but I guess that worked out okay that I did. So this is kind of the final slide. This is, there's an effort underway around specifically the Burlington proposal. And the two co-chairs are former Governor Howard Dean and current city councilors Raya Hightower. But just to clarify, the Burlington ballot question, which I'll put right in front of you here, it's a charter change question. So the city charter is basically the document that outlines the powers and authorities of the city of Burlington. And those powers and authorities flow through the state of Vermont. So ultimately, the state of Vermont controls what Burlington can do. And so when we pass a charter change, if this passes, for example, in March, the issue then goes to the state legislature. And ultimately, it's their decision. But typically, not always, but typically, the legislature will respect the will of the voters of that community, and they'll make the charter change for that community, but not always. So the first step is the voters need to weigh in. If the voters don't want it, it's definitely not going to happen. But if the voters do want it, then the legislature takes it up. And this is the exact language that's on the ballot. Shall the city of Burlington further amend our charter to adopt ranked choice voting for the elections of the city's city councilors, beginning with the March 22 election. And that's an important distinction. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Other than this being focused on the city council elections, how is this ballot question different than the one voters voted on 15 or so years ago?
Right. So this system of voting was in place in Burlington between 2009 and 2010, but it was in place for mayoral races. And the next two speakers, I think, I'm sure are going to speak to that history a bit and how in 2010 it was actually repealed by voters. Now here we are, 11 years later, and taking another look at this issue. The council initially passed a charter change proposal that would have implemented ranked choice voting for mayoral and school commission and council elections, but the mayor actually vetoed that, and the council didn't override the veto. So the council then brought forward this different proposal that would just be to use it for city council races. And I just want to
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead.
So is it essentially the same as the 2009 charter amendment?
It
Except
is the same voting system that was used in the 2006 and 2009 mayoral race in Burlington. Yeah, that's correct. And I do want to mention Councillor Hightower, who's the co-chair of this effort, Better Ballot Burlington, to promote this ballot item, was in a three-way race for her council race. And she has said that Councillor Hightower has said that if the two candidates that she ran against were already in the race, she probably would not have run at all. And I think this goes back to what we talked about earlier, that it increases the number of candidates, and particularly among women and people of color, who even enter into a race in these multi-way races. And Councillor Hightower, when she entered the race, there was only one candidate, but a third candidate came in. And again, like, she may not have even entered if the two candidates were already in the race. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind. And Councillor Hightower is the first woman of color ever elected to the Burlington City Council. And maybe that wouldn't have happened if the timing had been different, because I think a lot of people are hesitant to jump into a race where there's already a few candidates if they feel like they're going to be the spoiler, or they feel like they don't have a shot, all these calculations that discourage people from putting themselves out there in that way. Whereas this, it's really, with ranked choice voting, there's not that risk. You can join the race and know that you're not going to disrupt it for somebody else. You're not going to be told to drop out because you're a spoiler. You're able to be comfortable and be in that race.
So Jack Hanson, who is the city councilor from the East District in Burlington, just a final question. Better Ballot Burlington, are there other recommendations that are on the table through that group?
No, this group was formed specific to this ballot item around ranked choice voting. This is a newly formed group to promote that specific ballot item.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much for joining us and for your work on this. We're going to be going to a couple other folks. Terry Bouricious is one of them, who has experience with ranked choice voting from way back, and also Robert Bristow-Johnson, who has some alternative approaches to this question. So I want to thank you very much for your time and advocacy for this, and certainly your service on the City Council of Burlington. Jack Hanson, who is the city councilor from the East District. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. And thanks for all you all do to keep our democracy accessible.
Thank you so much. All right. Thanks for joining us again as part of our continuing coverage of Town Meeting 21. We're talking about a charter change in the city of Burlington, which has to do with ranked choice voting, which for some of you who've been around Burlington politics for a long time know that this is not a new idea. But ranked choice voting would apply to the city council positions only. We've had Jack Hanson doing some of that, or doing the presentation, but now we're going to be discussing in a little bit more detail. Robert Bristow-Johnson is a ward clerk in Ward 7. He's an inspector of election actually in Ward 7 in Burlington, and also has a background in algorithms. So he's going to give us his perspective on this charter change that is coming before the Burlington voters on March 2nd. And Terry Bouricious is a longtime activist and elected official as a city councilor in Burlington and a legislator from Burlington, and also works with an organization called Fair Vote. So thank you both for joining us. So glad to see you. We're going to start with Robert giving his presentation on a different view on this charter change question before the Burlington voters on ranked choice voting, and then we'll go to a discussion, comments between the two of you. So Robert, welcome, and why don't you share your screen and we'll get going.
Oh, wrong screen. Let me change that.
I know, so many tabs, so little time. There we go.
All right, so
floor is yours.
the elections are about majorities. Majorities of what? So about a century ago, the North Dakota Supreme Court had a ruling about Buckland ranked choice voting, which is another form of ranked choice voting, not that I recommend. And the part that's highlighted is important. They said, I need to minimize something here so I can even read my writing. There we go. Our system of government is based upon the doctrine that the majority rules. This does not mean a majority of marks on ballots, but a majority of persons possessing the necessary qualifications. That means citizens, voters having franchise. And the number of such persons is ascertained by means of an election. Elections are about the majority of voters as people having equal rights, equal franchise, and equally valued votes. That means one person, one vote, and it means majority rule. These two principles are sacrosanct about elections. If we violate them, we really are violating people's rights. So Jack had some examples of elections, and so I'm going to bring up an example of election. What if there was an election where 4,064 voters marked their ballots that they said candidate A was better than candidate B, 588 fewer voters, that means 3,476 voters, marked their ballots preferring candidate B over candidate A? You would say that candidate A is the majority candidate. Candidate B is the minority candidate. It's not a plurality, it's not a majority, it's a minority. So what if candidate B is elected? Whose votes count for more? Those voters that were 4,064 or those voters that are 3,476? If the 3,476 voters, if their candidate wins, their votes counted more than the larger number of voters that voted for the candidate that lost. So these candidates have names. Candidate A is Andy. Candidate B is Bob. In 2009 in Burlington, in this very city, 4,064 of us voted for Andy over Bob. We preferred Andy over Bob. Fewer of us, 3,476, marked our ballots preferring Bob over Andy. If Bob is elected, whose votes counted more? Well, the minority number of voters that voted for Bob, their votes counted more than the votes for Andy, even though there were fewer of them. That means that their votes had more value than the other voters. That is not one person, one vote, and it's not majority rule. And it's a failure of democracy. What happened in 2009 in Burlington, Vermont is a failure of democracy. Ranked choice voting promises us that it'll elect a candidate that has some sense of majority support of voters. Jack said that half an hour ago. But IRV failed to do that in Burlington 2009. Ranked choice voting promises us to protect the election from the spoiler effect. But IRV failed to do that in Burlington in 2009. We will get into that very shortly. Jack also talked about empowering voters to vote their hopes, not their fears, so that they don't have to vote strategically, so that they don't have to worry about who's the most likely candidate to win, so they can just vote their hearts, vote for the candidate that they want. Vote your hopes, not your fears. But IRV failed to do that in 2009 in our very city. So let's talk about the spoiler effect. Consider the 2014 Vermont election for governor. It looked like this. Shumlin had 2,400 more votes than Scott Milne, but there was a third candidate, Dan Feliciano, that had 8,400 votes. If those 8,400 votes had broken 2-1 in favor of the GOP candidate, Scott Milne would have been elected the governor, changing the winner. So we can say that Feliciano was or may have been a spoiler. We don't know because we don't know what the secondary choices of those voters were. But, you know, libertarians on taxes and on regulation, they're more like the GOP. And it's perfectly plausible that they would have broken 2-1 in favor of Scott Milne. But we don't know because we did not have a ranked ballot. So we do need a ranked ballot to learn from voters who they would have voted for. That's what we would have needed in 2014. But that was a softball because the spoiler, the potential spoiler, Feliciano, was nowhere close to winning. What would happen if you had a close three-way race? And that is what we had in 2009. That is the acid test, a close three-way race where all three candidates are plausible winners. So on top of that, we had the ranked ballot. So we know what people's contingency votes were. We know what their second choice votes were. And we know that there was a spoiler candidate. That candidate was Kurt Wright. Kurt Wright was a loser whose presence in the race actually changed who the winner was. Not saying that Kurt Wright ran as a spoiler. He ran as his totally legitimate candidate, but he ended up being a loser. And his presence in the race changed who the winner is. Because if Kurt Wright hadn't run, and the same Burlington voters came to the polls and voted their same preference with the remaining three candidates, that would have been Andy Montrol and Bob Kiss and Dan Smith, it turns out that Andy Montrol would have met Bob Kiss in the final round, and he would have defeated Bob Kiss in the final round by a margin of 588 votes. And that is more than 7%. It's about 7.8%. margin. That's not a small margin. Andy Montrol was clearly preferred over Bob Kiss in 2009, yet Bob Kiss was elected. He was not the majority candidate. That caused a spoiler to happen because the spoiler is always the loser in the final round. If IRV does not elect the majority candidate, whoever loses in the final round is the spoiler, because if he's not in the race, then the true winner will go into the final round and defeat the candidate that was the beneficiary of the spoiled election. And Bob Kiss was that beneficiary of the spoiled election. Vote your hopes, not your fears. What about those voters that voted for Kurt Wright, the spoiler? What does that look like? Here's what the breakdown is. This is the semifinal round. This is just before Andy Montrol was eliminated from the race because his total there of 2554 was smaller than that of Bob Kiss or Kurt Wright, even though he was the majority winner, which is easily shown later. But let's see what happens with these. Look at the Wright voters. Their largest group is 1,510 Wright voters that preferred Wright the most, but they would have settled for Montrol, and they certainly did not want Kiss to be elected. Now, they were promised that if they didn't get their first choice right, that their second choice would count, but it didn't. Now, if they had anticipated that their candidate would not win, all it would have taken was 1 out of 4 of those voters, less than 1 out of 4. If 371 of those voters or more had voted tactically or voted strategically, worried about that their candidate wasn't going to win and worried about who might win, and they didn't want KISS to win, all they would have had to do is insincerely bump Montrol up, forsake their favorite candidate, and that would have changed the election. Then, instead of Wright and KISS going into the final round, Montrol and KISS would have gone into the final round, and Montrol would have defeated KISS by 588 votes in the final round. So simply by marking their first choice as number 1, they caused the election of the candidate that they loathed. They caused the election of Bob KISS, whom they really didn't want to see elected. And they caused that election simply by marking Kurt Wright as their favorite voter. Vote your hopes, not your fears. They would have been better off voting their fears in the IRV election in 2009. In this liberal town, I got to choose between liberal or more liberal, because if I vote for the guy I really like, more liberal gets elected. That's how conservative voters that preferred Kurt Wright as their first choice, that's how they feel about what IRV did to their vote. They were screwed. Does not make them happy. Simply by marking their favorite candidate as number 1, they caused the election of their least favorite candidate. Why did that happen? Well, let's look down again at these 1,510 voters that marked Wright as their first choice, Montrol as their second choice, and KISS last. They were promised that they were promised, you can vote for your favorite candidate, but if your favorite candidate doesn't win, then your second choice vote counts. But their second choice vote didn't count. That's because IRV is opaque to the second choice. If your first choice is still in the running, and Kurt Wright went all the way to the final round where he lost, but if your first choice is still running, IRV doesn't look at your second choice at all. But it did for, say, the Montrol voters. Some voters had their second choice was visible to the algorithm. Other voters, the second choice was not, and that is not fair. That is not treating voters equally. Those voters, those 1,510 voters that voted for Kurt Wright and had a contingency vote for Andy Montrol, they were screwed because the promise that they were given, that they could vote for Wright, and if Wright wasn't going to get elected, then their vote would count for Montrol. That promise was not delivered.
Can I jump in here for a second?
Yes.
How long is this presentation going to go on? Because I've
couple more minutes.
Okay.
So I basically said that when this kind of thing happens to voters, it causes tactical voting in the future. They're going to have to worry about, well, gee, I'd really like to vote for the candidate I really like, but if I vote for the candidate I really like, the worst candidate gets elected as a result. And then they'll end up having to compromise and vote for the Democrat candidate, which is what they have to do now too. But the IRV of 2009 did not solve that problem for these voters. It's a bad thing. So in Burlington 2009, IRV failed to value every voter's vote equally. It did not accomplish one person, one vote. It did not accomplish majority rule. Hey, what's wrong with minority rule? Let's have the minority rule. It did not protect us from the spoiler effect. It did not allow some voters to vote their hopes, not their fears. They voted their hopes, and the worst thing resulted as a result. One last topic, and I'll be quick. It's about precinct summability. And as an election official, this is important. At the end of every election day, at our wards, Ward 7, Ward 4, Ward 3, all the wards, we have a ticker tape that prints out from the ballot machine that we post on the wall for people to look at subtotals of the voters. And whether it's campaigns or whether it's the media, they can total up the subtotals from each one of the wards and see who wins the whole race for mayor or for possibly the district councilor, which takes 2 wards, you know, or in the fall, it would be the legislative districts that transcends wards, that exists in more than 1 ward. They can total those numbers and see who wins the race for all of the wards, but you can't do that with IRV. But you can do it with first past the post. This method that both of us oppose, which is the current method, has precinct summability, but IRV does not have it. And so then it doesn't allow us to verify the election results in a transparent manner. It doesn't allow people to audit the elections in a transparent manner. This helps keep elections honest if we can have precinct summability and transparency. So as I said, the old-fashioned first past the post is precinct summable, but IRV is not precinct summable. The ballot data must opaquely be transported from the ward polling locations to City Hall. Everybody's going to have to go to City Hall to find out who wins. But reformed ranked choice voting, it's a term I'm going to use now, a form of ranked choice voting that consistently elects the majority candidate. That is precinct summable because we can add up the pairwise defeat totals from each ward and see what they are for the whole city. That's real voter reform. It's transparent and it's less vulnerable to sophisticated electronic election fraud. So these are what those pairwise totals look like. If you look down here in the corner here, you'll see Kiss and Wright. That was what came out of the IRV final round because it only considered Kiss and Wright. But Kiss did not have the majority of the vote because there's more candidates in there than just him and Kurt Wright. There's Andy Montrell. And against Andy Montrell, Kiss had a minority of the votes. Against Andy Montrell, Wright had a minority of the votes. Only Andy Montrell had the majority of the votes. Only Andy Montrell was the majority candidate. Bob Kiss was not the majority candidate. He did not get 50% of the vote. To say that he did get 50% of the vote, to say that IRV always guarantees that a candidate gets 50% of the vote is a falsehood. It is a lie from Fair Vote, and it is a lie on this question. It does not guarantee 50% vote. It actually failed to do that.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes, so I just want to open the floor here for Terry to ask you a couple questions.
I'll stop sharing the screen.
Well, asking questions is really nonsensical. There's a lot of misinformation there. There's so many things you said that are not true.
No, everything I said was exactly
Please
true.
Let me have my turn. Let me have my turn.
Everything I said was exactly
Ranked choice voting with the Condorcet is not precinct summable. You need to create a matrix for every ballot, and none of the software, no voting machine sold in the United States will put an output like you want. Here's the key fact. The system that you have designed is a laudable, fine voting method. No government in the world has ever used a system like that.
Wrong. In Portugal, they did.
Please let me finish. Please stop interrupting. No voting machine company makes a machine that can tally that vote. You cannot do a hand count because there's with an instant runoff vote, it's just like a runoff election. It uses the exact same dynamic that we're all familiar with. If no candidate gets a majority in the first round, you eliminate the bottom candidate and you have a runoff between the top two. That can be done as a hand count. Your system with matrices cannot be easily done as a hand count. Candidates cannot. Here's the key thing. You and I both agree that the current system used in Burlington is probably the least democratic of all voting methods because it allows a candidate that the majority of voters think is the worst choice to be declared the winner. That is completely unacceptable. What your argument is that your system is superior to the instant runoff voting, ranked choice voting, because your system will assure that the candidate that is the compromise that would defeat anybody else in a head-to-head will win. And that's a laudable goal, but there are negatives to that as well. because it changes the nature of the campaign. In a system like what you're proposing, a Condorcet system is what it's referred to, it encourages candidates to avoid taking controversial stands on any issue. It changes the nature of the campaign, because if a candidate has avoided making any enemies, they will be the second choice of all the voters. So a candidate can win under your system, even if not a single voter thought that they were the best candidate. They could win because they're the compromise who just smiled and kissed the babies. So your system is not a neutral. It's an important point is that Kenneth Arrow, who won the Nobel Prize for his proof that it is impossible to develop a voting method when you have more than 3 candidates that does not violate some definition of fairness in some situations. Every voting system has defects under some scenarios, including the system you're proposing. The system that you are proposing has not been used anywhere in the world, cannot be implemented on any voting machines currently being manufactured, and is an experiment of yours. It is not. The system that IRV is in Burlington is being proposed has been used for over a century by millions and millions of voters all over the world. It is a proven system. There will be
proven to fail in Burlington, Vermont.
Well, that's your argument is that Kurt Wright was the spoiler. The Kurt Wright voters say that
he was a loser who changed who the winner is.
He was the winner in a plurality election as we have right now. He would have been declared the winner because he got far more votes than
he didn't get 40%.
You're arguing that he was the spoiler, whereas most people would say
he was the spoiler because he was a loser who
changed
changed who the winner is.
All right. So you went on for like 20 minutes. Please let me finish. It's your redefinition of the word spoiler. Nobody uses the spoiler other than you to mean
no, that is the definition of spoiler. A spoiler is a candidate who loses an
your
election,
definition.
but his presence in the election changes who the winner is. That's what a spoiler is.
I guess we're just about out of time, but yes, every voting system has flaws, but most political scientists who study voting methods agree that the plurality voting system used in Burlington and most of the United States, which is unusual in the world because most countries don't use this system we use here, is probably the least democratic, as I said, because it allows the candidate that a majority of voters think is the worst choice to be declared the winner because of the spoiler scenario or other scenarios. IRV does not allow that candidate to win. The candidate that is the Condorcet loser cannot win under an instant runoff voting system. The important thing is that
Terry?
I'm sorry, we out of time?
I need Robert to be able to respond to you, and we only have 5 minutes. So thank you. I think I understand the gist of your position, Robert, if you'd like to respond.
Well, the fact is that everything that I said was factually true. The numbers were factually true. The fact is that in 2009 in Burlington, we asked the city of Burlington, who do you prefer better? Do you want Andy or do you want Bob? And the city said, we'd rather have Andy. Yet Bob was
ignoring
elected.
that more of them said they wanted Kurt Wright.
A spoiled election. That caused a spoiled election in which Kurt Wright was a spoiler. A spoiler is a loser in a race whose presence in the race changes who the winner was. Had Kurt Wright not run in that race, Andy and Bob would have met each other in the final round, and Andy would have defeated Bob by 7.8% margin.
That's unlikely to be true because if
no, it's exactly true.
Most
of the numbers support that, and the numbers come from the public
record. But the numbers ignore the fact you're imagining that Kurt Wright wasn't running, which means thousands of Republican voters the meaning would not have turned out to vote at all.
Perhaps if Dan Feliciano didn't run in the 2014 election of the governor election, perhaps Scott Milne would have won. But we don't know because we don't know who those voters that voted for Dan Feliciano, who they would have voted for between Scott Milne and Peter Shumlin. But we do know who we would have voted for in 2009. And we know for sure that more of us preferred Andy Montrell over Bob Kiss than the number of us that preferred Bob Kiss over Andy Montrell. Yet Bob Kiss was elected. And the only reason that Bob Kiss was elected
because he
was
won the runoff.
Spoiler candidate that happened to be Kurt Wright. Had Kurt Wright not run, Andy Montrell would, in the runoff, would have met Bob Kiss and would have defeated him. And
so
the numbers are so.
If a candidate who got no preference votes, no first preferences, who
Yeah,
got
he did.
zero votes.
He had
won the
over
election. Is that okay with
2,500 of
you?
them. He was not a weak candidate in
No,
any
but your
Yeah.
system would
He had
allow a
first
candidate.
preferences from over 2,500 voters.
You're focusing
All right.
too much on one election. The system,
Yeah.
the logic of your system
I'm
is that
focusing
a
on an
candidate that
election
gets
that happened
zero
in our
votes on the
city.
first round should be
In
allowed
our
to win
city.
the election.
Can I show
Okay.
one last screen?
No, you
All right.
can't. I would like you to sum up, Robert, if you don't mind, by telling us your position on this ballot question just succinctly, and
Okay,
then
this,
we'll wrap up because
We believe that this is going to be called question 4 in the upcoming election. And I'm encouraging people to vote no on question 4 because sometimes voting reform itself needs reform. And reformers are sometimes so self-righteous that they can't recognize that their own reform itself needs reform. And instant runoff voting needs reform. Election scholars in 2009, Terry and I had dinner over by Uncommon Grounds, and we talked about this for the first time. He turned us on to a meeting group of election scholars, which he was a part of. And Terry, you're in the vast minority. Less than 10% of election scholars think that IRV is better than Condorcet. Less than 10%. There are other organizations, electionsciences.org, that compete against Fair Vote for the hearts and minds of voters. They got Fargo, North Dakota to adopt approval voting, and they point to Burlington, Vermont as an example of the failure of ranked choice voting that Fair Vote sells to us.
All right. Well, I want to thank you both for joining us today. This is obviously a very heated discussion, and 2009 election is still alive and well. So thank you, Terry Bouricious, and thank you, Robert Bristow-Johnson, for discussing the charter change that's being proposed in the city of Burlington on ranked choice voting for city councilors. Thanks so much for watching, and stay tuned here to Town Meeting TV for more town meeting election coverage.
Thank you.